Welcome back to Voices of Long COVID. I'm your host, Noelle. This season, I'll be bringing you strategies and support for living with our condition and discussing current themes around the topic of long COVID. I hope you'll find the information useful. Today, we're addressing a topic that affects every single one of us living with long COVID and other chronic illnesses, and that's nutrition. For many of us, food becomes complicated, whether it's because of fatigue, nausea, food sensitivities, or just the sheer overwhelm of making decisions when your brain and body are exhausted. I'm thrilled to be joined by Lily Spechler, a registered dietitian based out of New York. She's a fellow long COVID sufferer dedicated to helping others heal from long COVID. Lily, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
How does having a chronic illness like long COVID actually change a person's nutritional needs?
Oh my gosh, I don't even know where to begin answering that question because it really is such a massive shift that happens in the body, specifically with long COVID, because ultimately so many of us end up with dysautonomia, so a dysfunctional autonomic nervous system where your body's ability to maintain homeostasis is really altered, specifically regarding things like blood pressure. And what ends up happening is your body works so much harder than the average person at rest. And all of that is very energetically expensive. So the demand is just so much higher. For example, a lot of us, when we have altered blood flow, will experience labored breathing. And labored breathing alone accounts for about 800 additional calories, which is almost half of our, of the average person's needs.
Wow.
And then you add on inflammation to that, and that is also a really expensive process because we never have inflammation without oxidation. So anytime there's inflammation happening, there's also going to be oxidative stress. And in order to make up for that damage, it requires a certain level of antioxidants as well as amino acids. So the needs are just so much higher in this population. And many of us also have a dysfunctional ability to use that energy. So, mitochondrial dysfunction, for example, is something that is a growing theory as to part of what's going on. So, not only do we need more energy, but we're also not that good at using it. And so, it's really a huge demand. And there's a massive shift that I think most people are totally unaware of because they're thinking, well, I'm sedentary, I don't need all of these additional calories, but that's totally not the case for the most part.
Interesting. Yeah, that leads into my next question. Are there unique needs when you are also sedentary on top of that?
Yes. So people don't realize that when you're looking at a BMR, it's really mostly to do with your organ function. So you can be completely sedentary and your body is still going to use X amount of calories at rest. Specifically, the brain actually uses 20% of our energy at rest. So it doesn't matter if you're running or literally bedbound, your body is still requiring so much more than you think.
Hmm. Yeah, that kind of goes counterintuitive of what I would have thought, right? In my previous life. And it was in terms of how much I'm exercising that would determine how many calories I need. That's really interesting.
Totally. And I think that's a place where a lot of people go wrong in this group because they're moving so much less. So there is that assumption there. But your needs in this moment are so unique compared to the rest of your life. And it really is so important to give yourself that extra dose of substrate to work with in order to heal. And it's probably not forever that your needs will be this high, but certainly for a time as you're going through recovery. And so many of us are going to end up needing to do some type of autonomic retraining, like the Utah Adapt, for example. And I think the people who have a really tough time with that and end up creating more damage than good are the people who are nowhere near close to the proper amount of intake coming in.
What are the most common nutritional deficiencies or imbalances that you see in people with long COVID?
So I feel like most dietitians with any type of platform are beating this drum in this moment, but I agree. So it's hard not to mention protein as the number one. It really is just so essential. And I definitely see the majority of people when they first come to see me are falling way short in that area where they think they're getting more protein than they are. And that ends up being so, so critical because again, we have this heightened level of inflammation. So we are bound to have oxidative stress. A lot of people in this population also will have muscle wasting largely because of how hard your body is working at rest. And it's so important to protect that muscle mass with as much protein as you can. So I really like people to be getting a minimum of 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. And then I will also say almost nobody when they first start to work with me is getting the correct amount of potassium. So that's another major deficiency that I see. And it's really underrated because with long COVID, many people will experience kind of a potassium wasting phenomenon where because the viral entry into the cell happens via something called the ACE2 receptor, that receptor gets damaged. And when we have a damaged ACE2 receptor, what ends up happening is we have irregularities in our renin-angiotensin system. And we get this buildup of a hormone called angiotensin 2, which causes excessive constriction and causes potassium to drop out of our cells.
Mm.
And this is exacerbated by many people supplementing sodium because sodium needs are higher. But what is often missed is sodium and potassium have a relationship with one another. And it's an inverse relationship. So if you go up too high in one without the other, it causes the other to drop. So we've already got this potassium wasting happening from the ACE2 damage, compounded by this incessant supplementation with sodium that then causes further dropping of the potassium. So it's a really big problem. And potassium is what actually draws water inside the cells. So sodium plays a big role in boosting hydration outside the cells. So it can boost your blood volume, but it's not going to actually hydrate inside the cells. And there's kind of this magnetic pull that happens between sodium and potassium. And that pull is very important for something called vascular tone, which is essentially how able we are to circulate blood around the body. So that's a really big problem. And I think it's like the unsung hero here, where it's so important to get a proper amount of potassium in order to work on that circulatory function. And also just the health of our cells. You know, I see potassium as like the thing that pulls nutrients inside the cells as well as fluids. So it's really, really just absolutely critical. And I like people to be around 3,500 milligrams. I don't like people to get potassium through powders for the most part. That's not ideal because that can be a little bit stressful on the kidneys. The body likes to keep pretty tight regulations on our potassium levels. And if we're just blasting our body with powders, it's really not a solution because that causes big spikes
Hmm.
that then force the kidneys to correct, like course correct and get the appropriate amount in the blood. So really we have to be getting it through food sources mostly because it's not just the amount we're looking at, but it's also the rate, like the rate of absorption. So food is going to be a slower absorption rate, which is very important for limiting stress on the body, basically.
So, what are some food recommendations you can make that have that potassium that we need?
So it's really, I mean, a lot of foods have a little potassium, meats, dairy, all of that's going to give you a little, but really the big players where you're going to get that like 1,000 milligram boost, it's going to be root vegetables and legumes. So when people are building their diet, I really like people to center root veggies and legumes as their primary source of carbohydrates.
Okay. Can you speak to the role of food in supporting the nervous system and reducing inflammation?
Absolutely. So I think, and I know we'll talk about histamine a little bit later, but low histamine diet is a really hot topic right now. And I'm totally actually in agreement with that. I think it is really important with long COVID. But what's underrated is one of the largest drivers of endogenous histamine release, meaning the histamine that gets released from our own body instead of histamine from the outside coming in. One of the largest drivers of that is actually low blood sugar. So it's really important to prevent our blood sugar from getting too low. And oftentimes, hunger won't show up like hunger in long haulers. It more so looks and feels like impending doom or anxiety or even pain,
Mm.
physically joint pain because of that histamine release. And it really is so critical to get enough food coming in so that your blood sugar is never dropping too low. And honestly, that's my biggest tip for nervous system regulation is eating 5 times a day and really centering protein at those meals so that your blood sugar is never getting too low. And that's going to do wonders for your cortisol response and your histamine response. And then there's so many different minerals that play a role in our nervous system health. So again, I think when we're talking about potassium rich foods, I love it because it's such a catch-all for other minerals too. Potassium rich foods, they don't just have potassium. When we're talking about root veggies and legumes, they also have magnesium and calcium and manganese and all these other wonderful vitamins and minerals that are going to be so supportive to the nervous system. Talk about calcium also specifically. I see a lot of long haulers taking away dairy, and I really don't support that unless you specifically know that you have a dairy sensitivity because calcium can be so soothing to the nervous system, and dairy is such an excellent source. Um, when you see people take away dairy, you'll watch it on their chronometer or other tracking apps. Their calcium will just be consistently low unless you're really supplementing. And for that reason, I do really think that's a good one to keep in there.
And what about reducing inflammation?
Well, it's really again when we're talking about long COVID, there's no way to talk about it without talking about inflammation. That's such a cornerstone of what this disease is. And when you have inflammation, what can happen is you get a lot of oxidation. So, what oxidation literally is free radicals go in and essentially try to steal electrons from your healthy tissue. And antioxidants, it's in the name, right? Like antioxidation. they're so important because they literally donate electrons to those free radicals. And it's like playing defense to your body tissue. So instead of damaging your body tissue and taking electrons from there, these antioxidants come in and protect your body from that oxidation process. And so they're just so, so key. So, as much as you can flood your body with antioxidant rich foods, you're going to be in better shape. And then also, amino acids are absolutely critical for reducing inflammation in the body. And so, high protein diets are just key. I often tell my clients if you were to walk into a burn unit with burns all over your body in a hospital, the very first thing you would do is be put on a really high protein diet to literally help regrow your skin. That's kind of the basis of what we need to build new tissue. It's like the building blocks of the body. So, if antioxidants are kind of the protectors, we also need the builders to help us regenerate and grow new healthy tissue. And that's really we're looking at amino acids to do that. So, protein is so, so key for inflammation as well.
Yeah, I've noticed I shouldn't say I feel better, but I feel worse if I don't have a breakfast that's high in protein. I definitely notice a difference.
Totally.
Can you explain how chronic fatigue or dysautonomia might affect metabolism or nutrient absorption?
So this is a tricky question. It's definitely going to look a little bit different on everybody. But so when we have dysautonomia, many people who experience dysautonomia are going to be in something called sympathetic dominance, where basically if we have two branches of the autonomic nervous system, our fight or flight or our rest and digest, so those are two different branches. If you're always having blood pooling from dysautonomia and your heart and your brain are not getting enough blood flow coming back to it, you're going to be in this chronic state of stress. And one thing that happens is when you're in that sympathetic response, that fight or flight response, your liver actually releases glucose. And that, from a biological standpoint, it really makes sense because if you were running away from a tiger or needed to fight a bear, it would be really helpful to have a little extra kick of sugar in order to do those things. But here, you're releasing sugar inappropriately all day long. And when you release sugar, your pancreas will release insulin, and that will cause your sugar to go low. So it's this constant process that can ultimately lead to a state of insulin resistance. And that can be a major driver of metabolic dysfunction and inflammation in this population. So that's one. And then also, similarly, if you were running or fighting a bear, it would be really inconvenient to have to go to the bathroom in the middle of that. So, part of what your body does in that stress response is freeze digestion, or you'll get it like in spurts. Some people will be like, well, I don't think my digestion is frozen. I get diarrhea, but it's not steady, smooth digestion like should be getting in rest and digest. It's kind of this spastic, irregular digestion. And some people will experience that like chronic constipation. Others will experience that like constipation and diarrhea. But ultimately, it can definitely lead to impaired nutrient use because, again, your digestion isn't really happening the way it should. There's also something, and this is a theory, but I definitely think it's a very compelling theory, but it's called the cell danger response, where basically when your cells think that you're under threat, your cells will kind of harden up and not let substances pass through. And it's a protection mechanism. And again, this is still just a theory, but I think it's really interesting. And even, in your body, when you're stressed, you can feel that tenseness. Our blood flow will definitely be impaired. But I also do wonder about, how much is that impairing what's coming in and out of the cell when we're so wound up like that. So all of those things can make it really challenging to absorb.
Hmm. Many of us aren't just dealing with long COVID. We also have things like ME/CFS, POTS, or MCAS. How can someone with multiple overlapping conditions approach nutrition without getting overwhelmed?
So I definitely recommend taking a phased approach. That would probably be my biggest piece of advice is don't try to swallow the ocean. Start with breakfast and then go to lunch and then dinner and then snacks. Maybe you spend 3 weeks just looking at your breakfast and getting really comfortable with what that looks like. So I think that when people try to do a big overhaul all at once, that's when it can start to feel a little overwhelming. We need phases and we need systems in order to be successful at this.
Mm-hmm. It's a good tip. There's a lot of talk in patient communities about cutting out gluten, dairy, histamines. What's your take on restrictive diets? When are they helpful and when might they be harmful or limiting?
This is such a tough question because I think it really depends on the person. But I will say, overwhelmingly, I am growing more and more in favor of low histamine diet for long haulers, even in folks where they don't think it's them. They don't think that they're getting histamine symptoms. When we go on a low histamine diet, it's really wonderful what can happen. And it's just, I've seen so much success with it that it's hard for me to think it's not a part of long COVID healing. So I do actually think that it's pretty important. However, I take a very middle of the road approach with histamine. I think there's some extremists out there where everyone's unique. Some people, it really you do have to be that serious about it in order to feel better. And so this is definitely not a blanket statement. But for most people, I try to take a pretty moderate approach. So the things I focus on are high bacteria and high acidity. Those are going to be your heaviest hitters. But then there's so many other foods where people are like, well, this is a histamine liberator, but many of those foods are also going to be high fiber. And ultimately, when we eat a high fiber diet, that's ultimately what actually stabilizes mast cells. So I take a really middle of the road approach, and then also I'm really looking the most at physiological stressors. So the food that we eat, it accounts for about 10% of our serum histamine, which comparatively, there's another 90% that's really driven by endogenous release. And that we're looking at these physiological and psychological stressors. So, how do we avoid things like low blood pressure? How do we avoid things like low blood sugar? Those are two really key drivers that are going to have the biggest impact on your histamine symptoms. And then, eventually people can expand. Most people will not need to be so low histamine and restricted forever. Dairy, I strongly recommend if you can have it in there. I really prefer it because it's not just a good source of protein, it's one of the best in terms of bioavailability. And it's so easy to use. So when we're looking at these conditions like ME/CFS, where it's so challenging to care for yourself and get enough nutrients coming in. Something like dairy, which is, you cut a slice of cheese and you're getting one of the most bioavailable protein sources. I'm in favor of that. So I think for some, it really is a sensitivity. For most, it's actually anti-inflammatory according to the research. And I think part of the reason is because it's so bioavailable in terms of its amino acid profile. So I really love dairy if you can do it. I think it's easy. It's got calcium and it's just great if you can. But, some people really can't. I don't think it's like critical. There's ways around it, but you do have to be more mindful about certain things like calcium. And then gluten, that's a tricky one. I think so. The problem with gluten is it's a really gummy protein. So if you think about like a pizza man spinning a pizza, you know how it expands and it gets stretchier and it gets, bigger and bigger and stretchier and stretchier. That stretchiness of the dough is the gluten formation. And when we eat gluten, those little stretchy, tough, elastic, hard to break down proteins can get kind of left behind in the GI tract. And mast cells hate foreign invaders. And also, just the immune system in general hates foreign invaders. And so, if we have these little fragments kind of hanging around, the body can perceive those as a threat. And especially in people with autoimmunity, and there's so many of us with long COVID who also have autoimmune diseases. Like personally, I've got a couple. I'm sure you might too. We all are dealing with, or many of us are dealing with autoimmunity as well. So, especially for those folks, gluten can be more of a problem. I think moderation is key. Some people say there's no such thing as gluten moderation. I think it depends who you are, but I'm a little more wary of gluten in my practice. And I think, when people can avoid it, I do prefer avoiding it just because there's so many options out there that are a little bit easier on the body to break down.
Yeah, there's so many options. I've been gluten-free for 18 years, and there's been
Mhm.
so much progress in that area. So yeah,
Yeah,
it's possible to be gluten-free for
totally.
sure.
Totally.
We're going to take a break and remind you that any discussion of modalities or treatments are not to be considered medical advice. If you believe you have long COVID, know that you are not alone. Seek out the many Facebook groups for community support, the Canadian COVID Society website for more info, and please speak to your doctor for medical support. We touched a bit on this earlier, but electrolytes come up a lot, especially for those of us with dysautonomia. I know I rely on my electrolytes to get through the day. Can you walk us through the basics? Why do electrolytes matter, and how can we balance them safely?
Totally. So electrolytes are really important in this group because, well, specifically sodium, because sodium plays a critical role in boosting our blood volume. So when we've got sodium, water follows sodium. So if we eat sodium and follow it up with fluids, what ends up happening is we can boost our plasma volume in the blood and make our blood volume a little bigger. So the plasma volume is like the clear white part of our blood, or like the clear see-through part. So it's not boosting the red blood cells. The only way to do that is really through exercise, which I know is complicated in this population. Um, but the plasma volume we can boost through sodium and fluids. There's quite a big range for what people need with dysautonomia. So it's anywhere from 2,000 to 10,000 milligrams, which is big range. And I think where people fall, and that really depends on your blood pressure and if you're someone who runs high or low. Because somebody with more of an hyperadrenergic subtype, they've got to be a little bit more careful with timing the salt and dosing the salt. So it just really depends. There's not really a blanket response because everybody, this is like where the hyper individuality comes in. And I do think it's important to experiment a little to see what's your best. When we increase sodium, again, we got to be so careful about increasing the rest of our electrolytes too. So, again, when I'm looking at carbs, I really prefer people to center those mineral rich carbohydrate sources because that's how we offset some of the potential negatives of sodium loading. Because over time, first of all, there's not a single research paper yet that looks at sodium supplementation in pots long term. Not one.
Really?
We don't know what the implications of it really are. What we do know is the needs are higher for sure, for a few reasons. When we have blood pooling, the blood pools around the kidneys, and the kidneys perceive high blood volume. So the way they correct that is excreting sodium so that water will follow to try to lower our blood volume, which like that's a double whammy because part of the reason they're pooling around the kidneys is low blood volume. So that's a problem. We have to be replenishing at a higher rate. And we know that people with POTS, when they stand, they have high heart rate and higher epinephrine levels, largely due to the lower blood volume in their brain. We have research that shows when we supplement with sodium and people stand up, their heart rate is lower and their epinephrine levels are lower, largely due to the fact that the blood volume is higher and there's more blood in their brain and heart. So I'm definitely not saying that salt shouldn't be supplemented in this group. That's so not what I'm saying. But I do think that because of the total lack of research about the scope of this, what happens when you supplement sodium for a long period of time, it's very important to be taking all of our minerals into account. And if sodium can have a hardening effect on the arteries over time, we definitely need potassium to complement it, which has a protective effect on our arteries over time and um, allows for that blood flow. So it's really, really important that we are not going down the calcification route, which, there's no way of knowing if we are or aren't because the research just isn't there. So I think, why not take a moderate protective approach, understanding that we don't yet have the research.
Okay. How can nutrition support recovery during crashes or prevent deeper crashes?
So, in the most literal sense, food is energy. And when we say crash, what we're often referring to is total lack of energy. And so it's so important that we're understanding that the most basic form of energy for the human body is going to be food. And that, it's as simple as that in a way, where it's just really important. We got to rebuild our energy levels and get a nourishing amount of food. I think the crash cycle can be so brutal because people get into these crashes where they're too exhausted to cook for themselves. And then because they don't cook for themselves or feed themselves, they get deeper into the crash. So, any way that you can break the cycle is absolutely key. I think having frozen, pre cooked foods on deck is critical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've definitely noticed if my blood sugar gets low, that is a certain recipe for a very quick crash for me. Like I absolutely need to keep on top of my blood sugar level.
Totally.
Can certain foods worsen or help cognitive symptoms?
Definitely. So, histamine can be something that creates a lot of brain fog in this population. And it's really eye opening for people when we're going through their food diaries. And I always have people track their symptoms alongside the diary. And we'll see, this day I had so much brain fog. And it's like, well, the day before you had coffee, orange, and avocado. And when we take those things away, it's pretty remarkable how much the cognitive function can improve. So I definitely think there's something to be said about the brain fog piece and histamine. I think even if you're somebody who you don't think histamine applies to you, if you have brain fog, try it. I
Hmm.
can't urge it enough because it really can be so pivotal for people. And then blood sugar balance, that's a big one when people are eating too much carb compared to protein. I can see their cognitive function really go downhill. And then also when people are not eating enough carbohydrate, I also see their cognitive function go downhill. So, carbohydrates are your brain's favorite form of energy. Yes, we can use other forms, but it's not ideal. So, when people take away their brain's favorite food, that can be a struggle for the brain function. And I definitely see that when people go keto or carnivore, the brain fog gets a lot worse. Not always, sometimes people do have these like short bursts of improvement. It's usually short term, but still. But more often than not, especially in people who try to do that for a longer period, the cognitive function will go downhill, the insomnia will get worse, the anxiety will get worse. And when we bring back carbs, it can be a big improvement.
So interesting. I'm going to send you my food diary, I think. What are some budget friendly nutrition ideas when people are on disability or a limited income?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the foods, a lot of these functional foods are not crazy expensive, like especially legumes, honestly, are pretty affordable. And for veggies, that's when I think it can get really pricey. So I'd say frozen veggies are definitely the way to go. And they last forever. You can buy them in bulk, and they're frozen oftentimes at peak freshness. So they're actually really low histamine comparatively. So those are great options. And then anytime you can get meat, buy it in bulk and freeze it. I think that's a much cheaper way to do it.
So many of us struggle with energy, physical, cognitive, or both. Even making toast can feel like climbing a mountain some days. What are some practical strategies to simplify meal prep or some go to meals for when someone can barely stand or think clearly?
Yeah, so I think this has got to be a top priority, especially if you have that debilitating fatigue. It is so critical to do it anyway. And some strategies that I have in place for my clients, I really like people to get silicone freezer trays that are like food portions. And in the beginning of the week, I'll have them do a batch cook. So typically 2 pounds of meat and then about 1.5 cups of dry carb, which then becomes about 4 cups. So, like lentils, for example, and then 4 cups of veggies. So, again, 2 pounds of meat, 1.5 cup of dry carb, 4 cups of veggie. Batch cook that and freeze it in those individual freezer portions. And then every time you eat, it's really just popping out one of those cubes. And so that can take care of your lunches for a week. Also, again, this is why I love dairy. Cottage cheese on toast. That's a great option and it's super easy. And I know it's a challenge to do that when you're that fatigued, but I think it's really important to not let yourself not, because when you skip meals, the fatigue will get worse. It just will.
Absolutely.
And so even if we're talking about peanut butter and jelly, cereal, hard boiled eggs that you make in an air fryer, frozen burritos, frozen meals, Amy's soup, anything, anything, but it's got to be something. It can't be nothing.
And what are some easy things we can stock our fridges and pantries with that we can grab when we're in a crash?
Yeah, so again, peanut butter and jelly is a staple, or like peanut butter and fruit on a sandwich. Doing high protein cereal is a good option. Frozen burritos, frozen shrimp, frozen chicken strips. Those are all great options.
Let's talk about appetite. Some people with long COVID lose their sense of hunger or feel nauseous or repulsed by food. What do you suggest in those cases, especially when someone knows they should eat, but they just can't stomach it?
So if you've never tried Pepcid, I think try it. If you're somebody dealing with these types of food aversions or nausea, um, or again, like that feeling of disgust towards food, so the thing about histamine is it's extremely acidic. So that can create an environment of too much acidity that is showing up like reflux or nausea or just this feeling of your stomach really isn't settled. And so for these people, I really, really always like to trial Pepcid because it's an antihistamine and it's an antacid. And again, histamine itself is so acidic. So Pepcid really can be something that is so cheap, so safe, so effective. And if you're somebody who's struggling to eat because of these feelings, I think it's really, really worth a try. And then also, low histamine diet can be really helpful because you might find that it's bananas giving you that feeling, or, it's other high histamine foods that are actually creating this type of aversion. And it can be really eye-opening to implement and see, oh, my nausea is gone, or that feeling of being totally unsettled has resolved. So those two things I think could be really huge. And they're kind of like one and the same because we're talking about histamine.
Yeah, and histamine is in so many foods. Like
Yeah.
when I got rid of spinach and
Mhm.
avocados, I noticed a huge difference in how
Yeah.
I felt. Yeah.
Right. And this is what's so funny because like these are superfoods,
Hmm.
So I think it's just funny how one food can be so healthy for one person and then for another person it's so dysregulating. And then even within this population, some people do great with certain high histamine foods. I have clients who get explosive diarrhea. They can't even look at citrus, but they can eat avocado all day, every day and feel amazing. So it's just really funny. It's not a one size fits all, even within the histamine conversation.
Hmm. What small, doable changes can someone make today, even if they're mostly bedbound, that might support their healing? It's a pretty general question, but
More protein and eating 5 times a day. I also think eating in compression can be really helpful for this population, especially if you're somebody who's bedbound, because when we eat food, the blood rushes to the gut to help us digest. And if you're somebody with blood pooling, getting more blood shunted away from the head and heart is going to be really dysregulating. So, eating with abdominal compression can be such a cheap and effective way to start getting more stable after meals.
is there a story or a moment from your work with chronically ill patients that gives you hope about what nutrition can do?
Oh my gosh, totally. So, there's two clients that really come to mind. And I mean, there's been so many clients at this point who have just had really incredible recoveries. So it's hard to not feel hope when you see that, and see it be able to be repeated in so many. So I really do feel a lot of hope. But one of my clients especially, she was somebody who was allergic to everything, including water. There was a point where she was literally reacting to water, was reacting to the sun, and it took us about a year, but she is now back to work and traveling again and, going to all her daughter's recitals and all of that. And
Wow.
so she's just somebody who just makes my heart really happy to think about, because if she can do it, you can do it. And she had lost like 40 pounds at her lowest, and there was even, talk about a feeding tube at one point. And seeing her recovery through that was just so amazing. She was able to gain back all the weight that she lost. And her story just, gives me so much hope, because I feel like she is somebody who, that was a low moment in her life for sure. That was definitely one of the more severe cases that I've worked with. And she's now, she sent me a message the other day. She was like 85% back. And it's just so cool to see that. And then one of my other clients had, by the time he had come to me, spent $70,000 on medical debt. So this is serious. And he was chasing down all these things. And it was really ultimately ended up being all about dysautonomia. So he thought, he was reacting to all these foods, but really his nervous system was just in a state of constant reactivity. And working through the dysautonomia and helping get his weight stable enough to start an autonomic retraining protocol. He's back to working. Well, he never stopped working, but he's working in a more normal way now, and he's traveling again. And, he feels relatively normal. He's like fully working out, and yeah, it's just amazing. So he's another person that gives me a lot of hope, because I mean, $70,000, if that doesn't tell you you're at the end of your rope, I don't know what will. And if he could do it, you could do it too. So, yeah. But there's been so many. Like, I think more often than not, people will find a way to feel better. And I think there's a lot of fear mongering that can happen on the internet that scares people out of that possibility of hope. But there are tools and there are steps that you can take to feel better. There's no magic cure, there's no magic pill, but there are totally steps you can take to make really meaningful changes. So, to anybody listening, I think no matter how bad you think it is, it's possible for you too.
That's incredible. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and practical strategies with us. For anyone who wants to learn more or work with you, where can they find you?
So, my Instagram is probably the best place. I'm at Long COVID Dietitian, and dietitian is spelled with two T's. There's no C. So, in case you can't find me, but yeah, that's probably the best way. And feel free to send me a message. You can apply to work one-on-one through there. I've also got a couple group programs going, and I would love to connect.
Well, thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you.
And to our listeners, if this episode was helpful, please consider sharing it with a friend, leaving a review, or giving the podcast a follow. Even on the days when it's hard to eat or move or plan, I know you are doing your best, and that's enough. Take care, and I'll see you next week. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Voices of Long COVID. I hope you found it informative. Please make sure to leave us a review. You can follow Voices of Long COVID on Instagram, TikTok, X, Blue Sky, and YouTube. You will find new episodes as my energy allows, wherever you listen to podcasts. Until then, stay safe and stay informed.